All right, so picture this. You've got your school bag, right? And you just check everything in there.
Yeah.
Total chaos. You know, can never find your pen, your calculator, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I know that feeling.
But then you think, right, I'm going to organize this thing. Textbooks together, pens all in one place, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Makes finding stuff so much easier.
Mm.
And guess what? It turns out living things are kind of the same.
Interesting.
Yeah, so instead of like pencils and all that, they're organized in these super clever ways.
Yeah.
But have you ever like stopped and wondered what it actually means for something to be organized like biologically, whether it's a plant or even, us?
Great question. And it's not like someone's going in there with tiny little hands tidying things up. There are these like fundamental rules of organization that keep every living thing, well, living.
Right. So in this deep dive, we're going to get into all that. The brilliant levels of organization in biology, from the absolutely tiniest parts all the way up to like whole systems working together. And we'll be looking at both animals like humans and plants.
Fantastic.
So our mission, if you will, is to unpack how all these different bits, these different levels, all fit together and work as a team, kind of like the different departments in your school, science, maths, English. They all have their own thing going on,
Yeah.
but they all come together to give you, well, an education.
Perfect analogy.
Okay, so let's get into it. Where does all this incredible biological organization actually begin?
Well, the very first level, like the absolute foundation, is the cell.
Right, cells.
Every living thing, whether it's a bee buzzing around a giant oak tree or, even you sitting there revising for your GCSEs, it's all made up of cells. They're like the basic building blocks of life.
Okay, cells, yeah, we've all seen those under a microscope. But how do we go from these tiny individual cells to something much bigger, like, say, your muscles?
Ah, that's where things start to get really interesting. So when you have a bunch of cells that are really similar and they all have basically the same job to do, they group together and form what we call a tissue. Now, a tissue might have more than one type of cell in it, but the main cells will all be specialists in a particular task. Like, you mentioned muscles. Muscle tissue. The main job there is to contract and allow movement.
Right, makes sense.
Or think about your skin. The outer layer of your skin is actually a type of tissue called epithelial tissue, which acts like a protective covering. So different types of tissues for different jobs.
Okay, so we've got groups of similar cells working together forming a tissue. So what's the next step up? What comes after tissues in this whole organization chart?
Well, next we have organs. An organ is a more complex structure, and it's made up of several different types of tissues, all working together to do a specific job, or, sometimes even a set of jobs.
Okay, so like give me an example of an organ.
Your stomach's a great example. You might just think of it as like a bag that holds your food, but it's way more than that. It actually has muscle tissue, which helps to churn the food around. And it also has epithelial tissue lining it, which produces acid to help with digestion.
Right, so the stomach's an organ with different types of tissues, all, kind of pulling their weight to make sure the stomach does its job properly.
Exactly.
So then what? Do organs team up as well?
They do. When you have several different organs working together to carry out a bigger overall function, that's what we call an organ system. And prime example is the digestive system. So your stomach is obviously a key player in that, but it can't do the whole job on its own. It works with other organs like your liver, your small intestine, and your large intestine. They all contribute to this big task of breaking down the food you eat so your body can actually use it.
Right, I'm getting it.
Yeah.
So it's like this biological hierarchy, right? Cells are like the base level. Then they form tissues. Different tissues make up organs, and then, boom, organs working together make organ systems. Kind of like leveling up in a game.
Absolutely.
So cool. Okay, so let's zoom in. Let's focus on one of these systems in animals.
Okay.
You mentioned the digestive system. Can you unpack that a bit more for us? What's so special about how it's organized?
Sure. So the digestive system, as we said, it's this organ system with one super important job. It takes those big, complex food molecules, like when you eat, say, I don't know, a burger and chips, and it breaks them down into really tiny, simple molecules.
Okay.
And your body can actually absorb and use these smaller molecules for energy and growth.
So it's like taking something complex and breaking it down into like manageable chunks.
Yeah, exactly. Think of it like dismantling a Lego castle into the individual bricks. Then you can use those bricks to build something else.
Love that analogy, yeah.
Mm.
So who are the main players, the main organs in this whole food breaking down process?
Okay, well, there are a few key ones. So first we've got glands.
Okay.
like the salivary glands in your mouth.
Yeah.
They make saliva, which, starts the whole digestion process off. And then there's the pancreas, which is a bit further down. These glands produce digestive juices. And these juices contain something super important called enzymes.
Enzymes, yeah.
Enzymes are like tiny little biological scissors that chemically chop up those big food molecules into smaller pieces.
Awesome.
Then you've got the stomach, which, as we said, is more than just a storage space.
Uh-huh.
It produces hydrochloric acid,
Okay.
which actually does a couple of really important things. First, it helps to kill any nasty bacteria that might have snuck in with your food. So it's like a security guard for your digestive system.
Sounds like it.
And secondly, it creates just the right acidic conditions, which we call the optimum pH, for a very specific enzyme to get to work and start breaking down proteins.
Okay.
And proteins are found in loads of things, like meat and cheese.
Now, the stomach is like a multitasking kind of organ, killing germs and chopping up proteins.
Exactly.
So then what happens to the food? Where does it go after it leaves the stomach?
Well, next stop is the small intestine. And this is where a lot of the action happens, in terms of absorbing the broken down food molecules into your blood.
Okay.
So things like sugars, amino acids, which come from protein, and fatty acids from fats, they're all absorbed here. The small intestine is actually really long, and it has this special lining that gives it a huge surface area. Imagine unfolding a towel that's been scrunched up. That's kind of what the lining of the small intestine is like.
Wow.
It makes absorbing all those nutrients super efficient.
Okay.
Then whatever's not absorbed moves on to the large intestine. Its main job is to soak up any water that's left. This helps to turn the leftover stuff into, well, poo, or, feces if we're being scientific about it.
Right, right.
And finally, the feces are stored in the rectum and then, well, expelled from the body.
So it's a whole journey,
Yeah.
like a food processing plant from start to finish.
Absolutely.
We talked about enzymes earlier. You said they're really important. What are they exactly?
Well, enzymes are these absolutely vital molecules. They're like tiny biological catalysts. Now, catalysts might sound a bit complicated, but all it means is they speed up chemical reactions without being used up themselves.
Okay.
So in your digestive system, enzymes are responsible for that chemical breakdown of those big food molecules into smaller ones.
Right.
But they don't just break things down, they also help to build new molecules in other parts of your body.
So they're like the body's tiny little helpers making reactions happen quicker.
Yeah.
But what makes them so good at their job? How do they actually work?
Well, enzymes are actually protein molecules, and their specific 3D shape is absolutely key to how they work.
Yeah.
Each enzyme has a special area on its surface called the active site. And this active site has a really precise shape that fits perfectly with the molecule it's supposed to work on, which we call the substrate.
Right. This is ringing a bell. Something about a lock and key.
Exactly. The lock and key hypothesis is a simple way to picture it. The shape of the substrate molecule fits perfectly into that active site of the enzyme, like a key fitting into a lock. And when they join together, they form what's called an enzyme-substrate complex. And this kind of temporary partnership helps the reaction to happen. Then the products are released, and the enzyme's free to go and work on another substrate molecule. It's a very specific tool for a very specific job.
Right. So the enzyme grabs the right molecule, it does its thing, and then it lets go, finds another one. Pretty efficient.
Yeah.
You mentioned before that enzymes need the right conditions to work their best, like the optimum pH and temperature. Why is that so important?
Well, because enzymes are proteins, they're pretty sensitive to their surroundings. Think about cooking an egg. If you heat it too much, the proteins change shape and it, becomes solid. Something similar can happen to enzymes. They have a preferred temperature. And it's usually around your normal body temperature, about 37 degrees Celsius. If the temperature gets too high, the bonds that hold the enzyme's special shape together can break. This makes the active site change shape so the substrate can't fit in properly anymore. And when this happens, we say the enzyme has been denatured, and it basically can't do its job anymore, like bending your key so it doesn't fit the lock anymore.
So too much heat messes up the enzyme shape and it stops working. Okay, that makes sense. What about pH?
Well, pH, which tells you how acidic or alkaline something is, it also affects the forces that hold the enzyme together. If the pH is too far away from the enzyme's optimum, it can also change the active site's shape and lead to denaturation. And it's important to remember that not all enzymes like the same pH. For example, the protease enzyme in your stomach, pepsin, it works best in very acidic conditions, which makes sense, right? Because of all that hydrochloric acid in the stomach.
Right, yeah.
But the enzymes in your small intestine, they prefer a more neutral or slightly alkaline pH.
Makes sense. Different parts of the digestive system, different jobs, different ideal conditions. You mentioned before that there are different types of enzymes. Can you tell us a bit more about the specific ones? The ones that break down different types of food?
Absolutely. So there are three main groups of digestive enzymes, each targeting a specific type of food molecule.
Okay.
We've got carbohydrases, proteases, and lipases.
All right, let's take them one by one. Starting with carbohydrases. What do they do?
So carbohydrases, like the enzyme amylase, they break down carbohydrates,
Carbs, yeah.
things like starch, which you find in bread and pasta, into simple sugars, like maltose.
Good.
Now, amylase is actually found in your saliva, so the digestion of carbohydrates actually starts in your mouth as you're chewing.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's also produced by the pancreas and the small intestine. Ever notice if you chew a piece of bread for a while, it starts to taste a bit sweeter?
Yeah, actually I have.
That's the amylase breaking down the starch into sugar.
That's so cool. So next up then, proteases.
Proteases. So, as the name suggests, these enzymes break down proteins, which you find in things like meat, fish, and beans. They break them down into their building blocks called amino acids.
Okay.
And pepsin, that enzyme we talked about in the stomach, is a type of protease. But there are also other proteases made by the pancreas and the small intestine that kind of finish the job of protein digestion.
Brilliant. And the last group, lipases.
Lipases. These break down lipids, which are fats and oils, into fatty acids and glycerol. You find lipids in foods like butter and oily fish. Lipases are mainly made by the pancreas, and they're released into the small intestine. And once all those big food molecules have been broken down by the enzymes into their smaller soluble units, like glucose from carbs, amino acids from protein, and fatty acids and glycerol from lipids, they can be absorbed from the small intestine into your bloodstream.
Okay.
And then they're carried to all the cells in your body to be used for energy, growth, and repair.
That's amazing. So enzymes are like what? Tiny chefs in our bodies,
Yeah.
turning our food into fuel and building blocks for everything.
Pretty much.
Okay, you mentioned bile earlier and said it helps with fat digestion. But it's not an enzyme, is it?
That's right. Bile isn't an enzyme, but it's a really important helper, especially when it comes to digesting fats or lipids. It's made in the liver and then stored in the gallbladder before being released into the small intestine.
Okay, so what does it actually do?
Well, it has two main jobs. First, it's alkaline, so it helps to neutralize the hydrochloric acid that comes from the stomach.
Oh, okay.
And this is really important because the enzymes in the small intestine, as we said, they work best in a less acidic environment than the stomach.
So it's like a pH regulator for the small intestine,
Yeah, exactly.
keeping things running smoothly.
And then its second job is to emulsify fats.
Okay.
So think about trying to mix oil and water. They don't really mix, do they? Well, bile acts a bit like a detergent and breaks down those big blobs of fat into loads of tiny droplets. It's like shaking up oil and vinegar to make salad dressing. They become more mixed up, but they don't actually dissolve into each other.
Right.
So by doing this, by breaking down those big fat droplets into smaller ones, bile increases the surface area that the lipase enzymes can work on. It's like having loads of little targets instead of one big one.
So it makes the fat digestion much more efficient.
Exactly. So it doesn't digest the fats directly, but it gets them ready to be digested more easily.
Clever stuff. Okay, so we've spent some time looking at the digestive system as an example of organization in animals. What other important organ systems should we know about?
Well, two other really important ones are the circulatory system and the gas exchange system,
Okay.
and they actually work really closely together.
Okay, so let's start with the circulatory system then. The heart is the main organ there, right?
Yeah.
Pumping blood all around the body.
Yeah, it's like the engine room of the body.
What's its main role in terms of organization then?
Its main job is to transport all the essential stuff your body needs to every single cell. So we're talking oxygen from the air you breathe and nutrients from the food you eat. And then it also picks up any waste products like carbon dioxide and carries them away to be removed from the body. Humans, like other mammals, have what's called a double circulatory system.
Okay.
This means there are two separate loops. One takes deoxygenated blood to the lungs to pick up oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide, which is the gas exchange part. And then the other loop carries that oxygenated blood from the lungs to the rest of the body, so delivering the oxygen and picking up more waste.
So it's a super efficient two-way delivery and collection service all in one.
Yeah.
Can you talk us through how the blood actually flows through the heart?
Yeah, sure. So deoxygenated blood, which has already been around the body and delivered its oxygen, enters the right atrium. That's one of the four chambers of the heart. And it enters through a big vein called the vena cava. From the right atrium, blood flows down into the right ventricle, and this chamber pumps the deoxygenated blood to the lungs via the pulmonary artery.
Okay.
In the lungs, as we said, the blood gets rid of the carbon dioxide and picks up fresh oxygen. Now, oxygenated, the blood returns to the heart, this time entering the left atrium through the pulmonary vein.
Okay.
And then it flows into the left ventricle, which is the most powerful chamber of the heart. It has these really thick muscular walls. The left ventricle pumps the oxygen-rich blood out to the rest of the body through the aorta, which is the biggest artery in the body.
Wow, that's quite a journey. You mentioned that the heart has 4 chambers. Why is that so important?
The 4 chambers, along with valves inside the heart, are really important for keeping that oxygenated and deoxygenated blood separate. Imagine if they mixed. It wouldn't be very efficient at delivering oxygen to your cells. And the valves act like one-way doors, so they make sure that the blood only flows in the right direction and it doesn't go backwards. Also, the left ventricle has a much thicker wall than the right ventricle because it has to pump blood all the way around the body against a higher pressure, whereas the right ventricle only needs to pump it to the lungs, which are pretty close by. The heart muscle itself also needs a constant supply of oxygen, and it gets this from the coronary arteries that run across its surface.
It's amazing how it all works together.
Yeah.
Now, I've heard about pacemakers. What exactly are they and what do they do?
So your natural resting heart rate, which is usually between 60 and 100 beats per minute, is controlled by a small group of cells in the right atrium called pacemaker cells. And these cells act like the heart's natural rhythm setter. They send out tiny electrical signals that spread across the heart muscle, making it contract in a coordinated way. But if someone's heartbeat becomes irregular or too slow, an artificial pacemaker, which is a small electronic device, can be implanted, and this produces those electrical signals and helps the heartbeat at a normal, steady pace.
So it's like having this little electrical engineer in there keeping everything on track. You also mentioned that there are different types of blood vessels like arteries, veins, and capillaries. What do they all do and how are they organized?
Okay, so arteries are the blood vessels that carry blood away from the heart. They have thick, muscular, and elastic walls because they need to cope with that high pressure of the blood being pumped out. The elasticity helps them to stretch and then spring back, which keeps the blood flowing smoothly. Veins, on the other hand, carry blood back towards the heart. The pressure in veins is much lower, so their walls are thinner and less muscular. They also have a wider lumen, which is the space inside the blood vessel. And this makes it easier for the blood to flow. And a really important feature of veins, particularly in your legs, are valves. They're like little trap doors that prevent blood from flowing backwards because, gravity and all that.
Right.
And then finally, capillaries are the smallest blood vessels. They have really thin walls, just 1 cell thick. This lets them easily exchange substances like oxygen, carbon dioxide, nutrients, and waste products between the blood and the body cells. Their walls are also permeable, which means that substances can pass through them. Capillaries form huge networks within your tissues, making sure that every single cell gets what it needs.
Okay, so we've got arteries, high-speed outgoing routes, veins, lower pressure return routes with those like backflow preventers.
Yeah.
And capillaries are like the tiny exchange points where everything happens at the cellular level.
Got it.
How does the gas exchange system with the lungs fit into this whole blood transport system?
Well, the lungs are the main organs of the gas exchange system.
Right,
They're located in your chest, or thorax,
Right.
protected by your rib cage.
right.
And their main job is to take in oxygen, get it into your blood, and remove carbon dioxide, which is the waste gas produced by your cells.
Oh, wow.
When you breathe in, the air travels down your trachea, or windpipe, which then splits into 2 tubes called bronchi, 1 for each lung.
Yep.
And the bronchi branch into even smaller tubes called bronchioles, which eventually lead to these tiny little air sacs called alveoli.
Alveoli, they're like tiny balloons where the actual gas exchange takes place, right?
Exactly. And ventilation, which is the proper word for breathing in and out, involves the movement of your rib cage and your diaphragm. Your diaphragm is a big muscle that sits underneath your lungs. When you breathe in, your rib cage moves up and outwards and your diaphragm flattens. This makes the space inside your chest bigger.
Right.
This reduces the pressure inside your lungs, so air rushes in from outside where the pressure is higher. And breathing out is pretty much the opposite of this.
Okay, so what happens when the air gets to the alveoli?
So once the air gets to the alveoli, which are surrounded by this amazing network of capillaries, gas exchange takes place. Oxygen from the air you breathed in moves across the thin walls of the alveoli and into the blood in the capillaries. because the oxygen level in the blood is lower. At the same time, carbon dioxide, which is at a higher concentration in the blood, moves from the blood into the alveoli to be breathed out.
Right, so it's all about things moving from where there's more of them to where there's less of them.
Exactly, it's diffusion.
What makes the alveoli so well suited for this exchange then?
Well, they have a few really clever adaptations. First, there are millions of them, all clustered together. This creates a massive surface area for diffusion to happen. Like, imagine a sponge with loads of tiny holes.
Okay.
Secondly, that network of capillaries we talked about, it constantly brings deoxygenated blood to the alveoli and takes oxygenated blood away.
Okay.
This keeps the concentration gradients for oxygen and carbon dioxide quite steep, which makes diffusion happen faster.
Right, so it's all about maximizing that difference.
Exactly. And thirdly, the walls of both the alveoli and the capillaries are incredibly thin. This means the gases don't have far to travel, which also speeds up diffusion.
So maximize the surface area, maintain the difference, and minimize the distance. Very clever.
Just on the blood itself, what role does that play in transporting gases and all those nutrients around?
Blood is actually pretty amazing. It's a liquid tissue, and it's made up of several different components.
Okay.
So the liquid part is called plasma, and it
Okay.
carries all sorts of things: glucose, amino acids, carbon dioxide, and importantly, the blood cells.
Red blood cells are the oxygen carriers. They have this unique shape, like a flattened disc.
Okay.
This gives them a large surface area. They also contain hemoglobin, which is a red protein that binds to oxygen. And they don't even have a nucleus, which frees up even more space to carry oxygen.
Cool.
White blood cells are part of your immune system. They fight off infections. And then platelets are tiny cell fragments that help your blood to clot if you cut yourself.
So we've got a whole team of different components in our blood, all working together to keep us alive and functioning. We've talked a lot about animals, especially humans. What about plants? Are they organized in similar ways?
Absolutely. Plants are just as organized, if not more so in some ways. They have these beautifully organized structures with different tissues and organs like the leaves and the roots, and they have a transport system that works a bit differently to ours, but it's just as vital.
Okay, so what are the key tissues we find in plants?
Right, so some of the main ones include epidermal tissue. This is the outer layer of the plant, and it often has a waxy coating called the cuticle. That helps to stop it from drying out.
Right.
Then you've got palisade mesophyll tissue found in the leaves, which is packed with chloroplasts. These are the structures where photosynthesis takes place.
Photosynthesis, the plant's way of making food.
Exactly. And then below that, there's spongy mesophyll tissue. It also has some chloroplasts, but it has loads of air spaces to allow gases to move around easily.
Okay.
And then plants also have vascular tissues. These are the transport tissues. Xylem is made of dead cells that form these hollow tubes.
Okay.
And they're strengthened by a really tough material called lignin.
Right.
And then there's phloem, which is made of living cells, and this transports the food, mainly sugars, around the plant.
Okay.
And finally, there's meristematic tissue. It's found at the tips of shoots and roots, and it contains special cells that can divide rapidly, which allows the plant to grow.
Right, so they've got tissue for protection, food making, gas exchange, transport, and growth. That's a lot of different types of tissues.
It is.
How do these all come together then?
Well, the leaf is a great example of a plant organ. It contains all of the tissues we just talked about.
Okay.
The epidermis on the top and bottom, palisade and spongy mesophyll in the middle for photosynthesis and gas exchange, and the xylem and phloem forming veins that transport water, minerals, and sugars throughout the leaf. You'll also find these tiny pores called stomata on the leaf's surface,
Okay.
usually on the underside.
Right.
And these are surrounded by special cells called guard cells that control the opening and closing of those pores to regulate gas exchange and water loss.
Right, so it can take in carbon dioxide, but not lose too much water.
Exactly.
So you've got the different organs like the roots, the stem, and the leaves all working together as a transport system for the whole plant, right?
Yeah. They work together to make sure that water, minerals, and sugars get to where they're needed in the plant. The roots, well, they have these tiny root hair cells that are specially adapted to absorb water and mineral ions from the soil. This water and the minerals then travel upwards through the xylem vessels in the stem to the leaves. And this movement is called the transpiration stream.
Transpiration stream. Sounds a bit like the plant's drinking through its leaves.
A bit like that, yeah. So transpiration is actually the loss of water vapor from the leaves and stems of the plant, mainly through those stomata we talked about. And the stomata need to be open to allow gas exchange to happen.
Right.
Now, because water molecules are a bit sticky, they're attracted to each other, when some water molecules evaporate from the leaves, it creates this kind of pulling force that draws more water up through the xylem from the roots. It's like sucking on a straw.
Yeah, I get it.
When you suck, you're creating a pressure difference that pulls the liquid up the straw.
Okay.
So this continuous movement of water from the roots to the leaves is what we call the transpiration stream. And it's not just important for moving water, it also helps to transport dissolved minerals up through the plant.
So it's like a two-for-one deal.
Exactly.
What affects how quickly this transpiration happens?
Well, several things can actually affect the rate of transpiration. Temperature is a big one. So hotter temperatures mean water evaporates faster, so transpiration increases. Humidity has the opposite effect. If the air is already humid, there's less of a difference in water concentration between the inside of the leaf and the outside air.
Okay.
So less water evaporates. Wind can also increase transpiration because it blows away water vapor from around the leaf, which helps to maintain that steeper concentration gradient.
Right.
And finally, light intensity also affects transpiration because more light usually means the stomata are more open to allow more carbon dioxide in for photosynthesis.
Right.
But of course, this also lets more water escape.
It's a constant balancing act for the plant then. It needs to take in carbon dioxide to make food, but it doesn't want to lose too much water in the process.
Absolutely.
You mentioned earlier that the guard cells help with this. How do they work?
Right, so guard cells are these kind of kidney-shaped cells that surround each stoma. They have thinner outer walls and thicker inner walls. When the plant has plenty of water, these cells fill up and become turgid.
Turgid.
Yeah, it means swollen. This causes them to bend outwards, which opens the stoma, and this lets the gases in and out and also lets transpiration happen. However, if the plant's losing too much water, the guard cells lose water as well. They become flaccid, which means they go floppy, and the stoma closes. This helps to conserve water.
Clever.
And they're also sensitive to light. They often open during the day when there's light for photosynthesis and close at night.
Right.
Also, you often find more stomata on the underside of the leaf where it's cooler and more shaded.
Okay.
Again, helps to reduce water loss.
It's amazing, right? All these different levels, from these tiny cells to these complex systems, all working together in both animals and plants to, well, keep them going.
I know. It's incredible, isn't it? From the simplest single cell to the complexity of organ systems, like, as we've discussed, the digestive system, the circulatory system, the respiratory system in animals, and the transport systems in plants. And each level is specifically structured to carry out its function with remarkable efficiency. It's the fundamental organization of life.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it makes you think, doesn't it, how a problem at just one of these levels could have this massive knock-on effect on the whole organism.
Yeah.
Like, what if someone had a blocked artery or a
Yeah.
plant had a disease that damaged its xylem? It makes you realize how interconnected everything is.
Yeah. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into biological organization, I think you might also find it fascinating to explore how different diseases disrupt these systems and how scientists are working to repair damaged tissues and organs. It's a constantly evolving field with huge implications for our understanding of life and health.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Fascinating stuff. Until next time.